With the U.S. dollar hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, there's concern about its status as the world's predominant currency. What are the global prospects for U.S. dollar in the current circumstances? And as China's RMB gains popularity in more and more countries, what are its potentials on the world stage? To discuss all these issues and more, I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Qian Jun, Executive Dean of the Fanhai International School of Finance at Fudan University, Stephen Roach, Senior Fellow of the Jackson Institute of Global Affairs at Yale University, and later on, Rebecca Christie, Visiting Fellow of Bruegel, based in Brussels. They're a topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Wang Guan. Professor Roach, let me go to you first. Recently, you warned about the decline of U.S. dollar, saying that it could happen at, quote, warp speed in the era of coronavirus, predicting that the U.S. dollar will likely drop by 35% against other major currencies. Tell us why you made that prediction.
Well, thank you. Currencies are a critical part of the adjustment mechanism for nations that have large current account imbalances. And the current account imbalances are a direct outgrowth of domestic saving or the lack thereof. The United States entered the coronavirus with a very low domestic savings rate, 1.4% of national income expressed on a net of depreciation basis versus a 7% average from 1960 to 2005. With budget deficits now exploding due to the recent enactment of coronavirus relief packages, the domestic savings rate is going to plunge deep into negative territory more than it's ever done, possibly falling as low as -5% to -10%. In that environment, and it will happen very quickly, the current account deficit is likely to exceed its previous record of 6.3% negative set in 2005. And so the large drop I see in the dollar is a response to that huge widening of the current account deficit. Added to that are the lack of America's commitment to global leadership, leading the way in deglobalization, decoupling, and trade protectionism, and another number of other issues from being very unprepared to deal with the coronavirus to our racial problems, which are breaking out in the open right now. So the dollar is, I think, likely to move down sharply in response to that confluence of forces.
But Professor Roach, do you really think that the hegemony of the greenback will end so soon? Because if you look around the world, the dollar is still used by, as some research shows, as much as 80–90% of the countries for their imports.
Well, I think that's true, and I don't look for the dollar to lose its role as the dominant reserve currency in the world over a short period of time. A 35% correction is not that unusual. It's happened in the 1970s. Again, it happened in the mid-80s. And we had a 28% correction in the early 2000s. But the dollar's role as a reserve currency is on the decline. It accounted for about a little over 70% of official foreign exchange reserves in 2000. Now that number is a little below 60, but it's headed lower. And as for the other currencies, I think surprisingly, the undervalued euro is likely to benefit the most from the dollar's decline, as will the renminbi. But the euro is the currency I'm focusing on the most.
Well, Professor Qian, what do you think? Do you think the dominance of the U.S. dollar will change given President Trump's policies, given the economic downturn from COVID-19?
I agree with the points made by Dr. Roach. There's one point that's in favor of the dollar, As we have seen already once in the 2007-2009 global financial crisis, and that is again because there's no true substitute of the dollar. As we've seen, the euro failed to be that substitute during the previous crisis. During a time period of global uncertainty, global institutions, governments, they still rely on the dollar. That is, the demand for a safe asset, that is, until another currency or two can replace the dollar-denominated assets remain the safe assets. The demand for safe assets will actually go up very quickly. We've seen that in the 07-09 crisis. We've seen some of that now. Some of that demand, extra demand, is due to technical demand for rebalancing assets in the U.S. So I agree that over a longer trajectory, the debt to GDP ratio, the U.S. government debt, that's a long-term problem. How soon can the U.S. economy recover? The savings rate and so forth are all in play. But as long as the dollar remains the only quote-unquote true safe assets during uncertain periods, its status as the only true global reserve currency will not go away, even though on a trajectory it's declining over time.
Right. People are talking about the status of the U.S. dollar and how that may or may not change given the economic downturn and the domestic structures, the economic structures. Some folks, I want to show you some of their comments over there. This is very interesting. For example, we have this friend called Espresso Please saying that, are we supposed to trust the euro and the Japanese yen more so than the U.S. dollar? In the competition of the least bad, I think U.S. dollar is still not so bad. Professor Roach, do you want to comment on this friend's assessment?
Well, let me just say something on behalf of the unloved euro. I will confess that I have been a so-called euro skeptic for most of the last 20 years. But time and again, Europe has avoided a crisis. And I think the actions taken recently by Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron to lead to the establishment of the next generation EU fund, 750 billion euros, together with the likelihood of a pan-European sovereign bond that could well be that additional risk asset that the good Professor Chen just said was missing in a crisis. I think we have to look at Europe as defying the calls for its demise from economists and observers like myself, who have always felt that Europe, the European Monetary Union, was only another crisis away from dissolution. I don't think that's any longer a likely outcome, and I think the euro, which is very undervalued compared to an overvalued dollar, will benefit more than we think.
Well, I want to show you another piece of comment online. This user, friend, codenamed Rhode Island King, said that the problem is that other countries will do the same thing and print more money in order to avoid the impact of a weaker dollar. So it will be a dead cycle given the dollar's current status, unless the euro and the RMB are stronger. Professor Chen, what do you think of that comment?
Actually, let me talk about the Eurozone first. I agree with Dr. Roach that this time around they acted more quickly, more decisively, and the scale of their stimulus, whether it's on the fiscal side or on the monetary side, is not as large as the U.S. That's one. So that signals relative strengths of the euro vis-a-vis the dollar. The second thing I want to add is that during the previous crisis, we worry about the weaker countries in the Eurozone. We're still very concerned about countries like Italy. But if you look at Germany, a country like Germany, the largest economy, they have a lot of room in terms of their fiscal policy, right? So their debt to GDP ratio is among the lowest, certainly much lower than the U.S. And they were aggressive in terms of they will have fiscal expansion to fight the virus-induced economic recession. So judging by what has happened, I think overall the EU zone's policies have been effective. And they're not overly aggressive in terms of monetary policy. So that's for the Eurozone. And certainly for China, if you look at all the policies we've seen so far, whether it's monetary policy or fiscal policy, even though China has, I think, more room on both sides, again, if you look at the debt to GDP ratio, China's ratio is pretty low. China has not been overly aggressive. So that signals that in the longer term, both the EU zone and China, in terms of the amount of money has been printed is less, that should signal stronger movement down the road. But again, as I said earlier, at the moment, when there's global uncertainty, when this uncertainty spikes up, people maybe in a mode of panic, perhaps still want the safe assets. And as of now, the safe assets seems to be still dollar denominated.
Well, let's talk about President Trump's policies and what's many believe to be weaponization of the U.S. dollars. You know, we look at U.S. foreign policy, and then you know, there has been an increasing number of sanctions, you know, against Russia in 2014, against Iran more recently, and think about how many countries and their institutions are affected by U.S. sanctions. So my next question is to Professor Roach. How necessary do you think it is for China and Russia to set up their alternative payment systems to, you know, avoid over-reliance on the dollar?
Well, I think the trend among major economies and their financial systems is moving in the direction of direct electronic transfer through some version of blockchain or cryptocurrency. And I think the sanctions point that you raised is only one consideration in that regard, but there are you know, a number of other considerations that are driving this trend in terms of the efficiency of market-based transactions and even tighter regulatory oversight of electronic currency issuance and circulation. So I think the sanctions point is less significant than those broader considerations in terms of driving this trend.
Well, yeah, Professor Chen, China has been promoting its own payment system called, you know, Crossborder interbank payment system. How has it been faring so far? I mean, what are the challenges?
As we talked about, SWIFT, that's the dominant cross-border payment system that's dollar-based. It's an organization that's based in Brussels, I believe, but the U.S. government has a lot of control over it. And you talk about these sanctions against certain countries. They can do that through the SWIFT system, where they block certain institutions or countries from participating in the SWIFT. As you mentioned, China has a system. It's called CIPS, where in this system, it's RMB. RMB is one of the main assets, currencies for settling trade and these cross-border transactions. It's actually growing steadily. But if you look at the scale of CIPS and SWIFT, even though CIPS in terms of technology in recent years is doing quite well, but the scale of CIPS and SWIFT, it's still much smaller than SWIFT. So it's not replacing, certainly it's not replacing SWIFT, that's one. Let me also point out that in addition to CIPS, the Europeans also has a system that was set up last year. It's called INSTEX, I-N-S-T-E-X.
Right.
They set up the system precisely to avoid these sanctions the U.S. might put on them by doing trades with Iran. So again, INSTEX is another payment system where allows them to do non-dollar, non-SWIFT transactions with Iran, in particular humanitarian transactions related to fighting COVID-19.
But
so they're basically
right.
around the globe. It's not yes.
Yeah, we'll have a European friend joining us soon to talk about INSTEX. But before we do, let's focus on the internationalization of RMB. Many observers say that there are a whole lot of challenges ranging from a lack of, relatively speaking, free movement of capital and some technical details, such as covering all the time zones where the world's financial institutions are located. Can you explain to our viewers those challenges and how China hopefully can get over those challenges?
So right, that's a good question. So first of all, as we've been discussing, it's actually good to have another one or two currencies not to take away the status of dollar, but to have more alternatives, if we will. So if RMB can rise in status, especially as a reserve currency, along with euro, RMB, and Japanese yen, you then can have a basket of alternative currencies relative to the dollar. And that development is not only good for China, but it's actually good for the world, for the global financial system, especially for emerging markets. So that's the first point. The second point is, if you look at RMB in recent years, its status has risen very quickly as a trade currency, as a currency for clearing these transactions. What's been lacking is the status as a reserve currency. If you look at the central banks around the world, whether they have RMB denominated assets as their reserve, that ratio is very low. So in order to be a reserve currency, as you already mentioned, one of the important things is that capital has to move in and out of China more freely. But on the other side, there is this problem that's bothering emerging markets. That is, if you have completely free capital flowing out of the country, it's actually very hard to avoid what we call a dollar cycle. That is, the extra liquidity coming out of the U.S. might go to these emerging markets. When these capital come in, they can bid up the prices of the assets, and then when these capital flows out, it's gonna have a very bad effect on the domestic financial system, including domestic currency. So after the Asian financial crisis more than 20 years ago, even institutions like IMF advocate emerging markets to have some level of capital control. So for the RMB to rise as a reserve currency, basically it needs to find a balance that to make capital coming in and out of China more freely, but that inflow and outflow must be on a balanced level. What that means is, in any short period of time, it's not good to have huge amount of capital coming in or out in a sudden. So that's a very interesting goal that we're going.
Right. That's a very, I think, important point to point out. Right now we have Rebecca Christine, visiting fellow at Bruegel, based in Brussels. Thank you for joining us, Rebecca. We were talking about alternative payment systems and the status of U.S. dollar. As we know that the U.S. looks increasingly willing to use this hegemonic currency to extend its domestic policies beyond its borders. Do you think this is an opportunity to actually boost the euro as a global currency?
The dollar really has been the world's global currency for a long time and looks set to stay that way. The euro is coming from possibly the world's largest consumer market, but still has not addressed a lot of the fundamental weaknesses that led to its sovereign debt crisis 10 years ago. While the euro is deciding how much and whether to integrate its capital markets and how much and whether to complete the banking union that it has made huge strides with since that crisis, the dollar is the dollar, and people who want something that is safe, liquid, and universally traded will continue to look there.
But when you think about U.S. sanctions that already made many countries, including the Eurozone countries, set up their own payment systems, right? Think about, as Professor Chen just talked about, the INSTEX system, or Instrument in Support of Trade Exchanges. Can you talk to us about the system and how it has helped Europe bypass the Iran sanctions launched by the U.S., among other things?
My understanding of INSTEX is that it is designed primarily for humanitarian trade flows, and it is primarily designed for people who do not need to have contact with the U.S. financial system. That's the thing about how interconnected markets are now. Pretty much everyone needs access to the U.S. banking system, even if they don't necessarily want to spend any time in the actual U.S. So what INSTEX does is it sets up almost a barter system, I've heard it called. I don't have the technical specs at my fingertips, but I can get back to you if need be, that allows people who aren't doing business with the U.S. to build the kinds of relationships to make sure that the EU can do in food and in other things that it believes are merited to continue no matter what else is going on politically globally.
Let's stay in Europe. Professor Chen, I want to go to you. Let's talk about Russia and its own payment systems. In 2014, since
I can no longer hear you. I'm
the
very sorry.
Sorry. Professor Chen, let's talk about Russia's own payment system. It's called the System for Transfer of Financial Messages, or SPFS. How has that system been doing so far?
I have not looked at recent data on how large the system is. I also I heard that Russia was also interested in joining INSTEX, the EU system that we talked about. So there's no doubt that more large economies, China, Russia, and others, need to find their own system, or a system that's non-dollar dominated system to maintain normal financial transactions. And CIPS is no different from that. The other thing I actually want to point out is that for China, the other thing that's very important to have a system outside the dollar denominated system is this central banks have these swap lines. Right? So the U.S., the Federal Reserve has renewed and actually increased the size of these dollar swap lines with ECB and other major central banks, but that system excludes China, countries like China. So what China has been doing is that the central bank, using bilateral agreements mostly, and talking to some unions of Asian economies to set up their own swap lines. That's actually very important too, because in time of crisis, these swap lines can make sure that the financial system of all of these countries in the network have enough liquidity to manage.
Well, Rebecca, in Brussels, I want to ask you this. How big a challenge do you think it is when you think about President Trump's so-called, as many experts believe, the weaponization of dollars? Think about it's pressuring its own Federal Reserve to change interest rate, and also sanctions launched on other countries, printing lots of money. How will that change the calculations of other countries?
Printing lots of money is an interesting one, because one of the ways the U.S. does that is to sell treasury bonds, which then go out into the world. So by going into debt to do all of the spending programs that the current administration wants, and by creating all of these dollars, they do not weaponize the dollar so much as send it round and round to do all the things it usually does. In terms of what the administration can do, luckily the Federal Reserve has been independent and has held fast with doing what the central bankers think is best for the economy. So Trump is mostly talking to his base here and looking for ways to mobilize American xenophobia and racism in hopes of winning re-election in November.
Well, you know, former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton recently wrote a book, of course, and in that book he claimed that Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin opposed the Trump administration's increasing reliance on economic sanctions, worrying that an over-reliance on such measures will weaken the global primacy of the dollar. Do you agree with that assessment, Rebecca?
It's certainly a concern to keep in mind. A lot of these sanctions are not very effective, do not penalize the people who ostensibly they are being put in place to penalize, and do not make sense if your goal is to have a thriving U.S. economy.
And Professor Chen, what do you think? Do you have anything to add on that issue?
Sure. So again, I think there are two things here that's important. The U.S. Federal Reserve System, even though it's facing a lot of pressure from the administration, but if you look at the history, it remains pretty much independent, and that's important in that we can foresee in the future, once the economy is coming back in the U.S., the Federal Reserve System can unwind, quote unquote, this extra money supply, as we've seen after the 08-09 financial crisis. But even when they unwind this money supply in the U.S., it will still have a ripple effects in emerging markets, as we've seen before. So that's the first thing, that we still have more hope on the U.S. Federal Reserve System in terms of having a responsible, steady long-term policy. That's one. Two, it's very important that, especially during economic crisis induced by COVID-19, the lessons we've learned from the Great Depression is that we need a lot more global cooperation. You know, a lot of times fiscal stimulus or monetary stimulus actually have side effects. But at the moment, a stimulus that has almost no side effects is if we just drop all the tariffs we impose on each other. Because tariffs, at the end of the day, it's going to be paid by domestic consumers. So these sanctions, I agree, these sanctions don't work very well. In fact, they don't help to stimulate the U.S. economy.
And Christy, finally, my last question to you. Do you think the digital currency will be a new area that people will focus heavily on? You know, think about China's own currency that has been rolled out earlier this spring, and Facebook had its own currency called Libra. Of course, that was shut down by the Trump administration.
Well, Libra had a lot of issues going on. I don't think the Trump administration can get credit for blocking that from coming into fruition. Digital currencies and digital payment systems are very much in their development stages. It remains to be seen which models will be most effective for conducting transactions and storing wealth around the world. There are some really interesting international regulatory studies going on right now in the G20, for example, about how these things work and which ones are going to be most useful. The question will be, when is it a currency with its own central bank and its own support, and when is it a payment system where it's linked to other currencies that have that central bank support? If you don't have some central bank oversight, I don't think you can make it into the world's major currencies. All of the currencies that are the best known and the best trusted by investors have a mature central bank like the Fed.
All right, Rebecca, I'm sorry, but I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Professor Chen and Rebecca, Christine, thank you all. Thank you both so much. And that will do it for this edition of Dialogue. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Thank you for watching.